On the morning of October 7th, Palestinian militants from the terrorist organization Hamas launched a full-scale attack on Israel, declaring the beginning of an operation they called Al-Aqsa Flood. The assault began with thousands of rockets fired into Israeli territory. Soon after, militants crossed the border from multiple directions, by land, sea, and even air. Some attackers used motorized paragliders, indiscriminately shooting both civilians and military personnel they encountered. Within the very first day, hundreds of civilians were killed. Hundreds more were taken hostage and transported into the Gaza Strip. Whether many of them are still alive remains an open question. Hamas later issued an official statement explaining the attack. According to them, the assault was a response to Israel's long-term blockade of Gaza, the occupation of Palestinian territories, and alleged crimes against Muslims, including what they described as the desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. What you just heard is their version of events, directly from the terrorists themselves. But in this video, we're not focusing on their justification. We're focusing on the fact itself, because this was the largest and deadliest attack on Israeli territory in decades. For example, journalists at Bloomberg called it the biggest failure of Israeli intelligence in the last 50 years. U.S. officials initially stated that they had no prior knowledge of the attack being prepared against a key ally. However, things may not be that simple. According to ABC News, citing their sources, U.S. military intelligence within the Pentagon was aware of preparations for an attack and allegedly had enough time to warn Israel. If true, this would be absolutely unprecedented. A terrorist organization carrying out simultaneous coordinated attacks from the air, sea, and land at this scale is something the world has rarely seen. My name is Alex Blackwood, and you're watching Behind the Scenes of Power. If you're new here, welcome. I hope you'll consider subscribing and staying with the channel, because in this video, I'll break down who Hamas really are, why they emerged in the first place, what they fight for, and what they demand, how a relatively small group turned into one of the most powerful players in the region, where their funding comes from, who supports them, and where the next escalation between Palestinians and Israelis could lead. You can support this video with a like or a comment. It really helps the channel grow. And now, let's start from the beginning. The First Palestinian Intifada. This story begins with the First Palestinian Intifada, a mass uprising of Palestinian Arabs that erupted in 1987. Large-scale protests, violent clashes with Israeli forces, and internal confrontations claimed the lives of more than 2,000 people. At its core, the Intifada was declared as a struggle against Israel's occupation of territories captured during the Six-Day War. Although Israel later returned most of these territories in exchange for peace, that fact no longer mattered to radical Palestinian factions. The First Intifada is generally considered to have ended in September 1993, when Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization signed what became known as the Oslo Accords. These agreements were supposed to lay the foundation for the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. As we can clearly see today, that never happened. One of the key reasons was the active sabotage by terrorist organizations and extremist groups who categorically rejected any form of coexistence with Israel. This internal conflict eventually led to a split within the Palestinian movement. On one side was the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. They were radicals, but they were willing to negotiate. And during the Intifada, a new force emerged: Hamas, a group that openly rejected compromise and openly embraced armed struggle. Hamas made its position clear from the start. It did not recognize Israel's right to exist as a state. And yet, there was a strange contradiction in their messaging. Unlike the PLO, Hamas refused to recognize Israel, but at the same time it could speak about a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. A paradox, to say the least. For Hamas, it wasn't enough to have a state in the West Bank and Gaza. In their ideal scenario, Christians, Jews, and Muslims could live there, but only under what they described as an Islamic state. And what happens to the people who refuse that future? In Hamas's worldview, the answer is brutally simple: eliminate them. That uncompromising ideology is one of the reasons Hamas didn't just grow quickly, it also evolved into a political force. Back in 1988, shortly after the First Intifada began, analysts were already warning, you can't erase radical movements and terrorist organizations overnight. In fact, the attempt can backfire, opening the door to even more violence. So, instead of endless, large-scale confrontations, the argument was that other solutions had to be found. Because when a society can't reach consensus, fundamentalists can win. And without historic change, everything shifts toward escalation, and radicals gain the advantage. That advantage has a name: the Gaza Strip. On the map, it looks like a tiny dot, but it contains enormous power, and that power doesn't always come with good intentions. Gaza is a small territory, roughly 41 kilometers long and about 10 kilometers wide, wedged between Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea. Historically, Gaza was once controlled by Egypt. Israel captured it during the 1967 war, along with other territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and more. Over time, Israel returned or withdrew from parts of these areas, sometimes as part of agreements, sometimes unilaterally. Gaza is no exception, but we'll get to that part in a moment. Today, more than 2 million people live in Gaza, and the population density is among the highest in the world. According to the UN, a huge share of Gaza's residents are registered refugees, roughly 1.7 million, and more than 500,000 of them live in 8 overcrowded refugee camps spread across the Strip. That's the situation, in very simple terms. And it's in Gaza, in 1987, that Hamas appears. Hamas emerged as an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And, early on, its ideology rested on 3 pillars: religion, charity, as strange as that may sound, and armed struggle against Israel. But their first enemies weren't only external. From the beginning, Hamas also clashed with Palestinian rivals. For example, Yasser Arafat and the Fatah movement. We'll talk about that later. At the center of it all was one of Hamas's key founders and spiritual leaders, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. His views were uncompromising, and so were the people who followed him. In Hamas's founding charter, the group explicitly commits itself to the destruction of Israel, and armed violence is presented as part of that struggle. Hamas's military wing was built using older models of Palestinian armed groups that appeared in the 1950s, after Israel was founded. But with one major difference: those earlier groups weren't operating the way Hamas would. And, by the early 1990s, after Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords, Hamas adopted a new tactic: suicide bombings. Some of the first attacks of that kind targeting Israel are recorded in 1993. If you're wondering why Hamas was so fiercely opposed to Oslo, the explanation is straightforward. They didn't want the PLO, which at the time claimed to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, to sign any peace deals with Israel. In other words, Hamas believed the PLO was acting too softly, so Hamas pursued what it considered the simplest and clearest goal: the destruction of Israel, which they presented as the root cause of the Palestinian people's problems. Now let's talk about what's actually happening inside Gaza. Because, in practice, Hamas consolidated its power in the Gaza Strip in 2005, after Israel withdrew its troops and dismantled its settlements there. And from that moment on, the next chapter begins. Hamas's adventure in Gaza didn't take long to turn into real power. By the very next year, they had won a majority in the legislature and even formed their own government. But the true turning point was 2007. After a period of deadly chaos in Gaza, and after the 2006 election results brought Hamas-backed candidates into power, Hamas also managed to seize full control of the coastal enclave by force. Israel looked at that outcome and drew an obvious conclusion. A leadership this radical could use Gaza to stockpile resources, build capabilities, and eventually strike Israel, pushing toward Hamas's openly stated goal: destroying the neighboring state. And Hamas didn't exactly hide it. Their leaders and supporters were blunt about what they wanted. So Israel took the next step, the Gaza blockade. Movement of people and goods into and out of Gaza was heavily restricted. At the time, Israel's government argued this was necessary, that it would prevent Hamas from developing and acquiring weapons. Whether that strategy worked or not, we can judge today, especially after what happened on October 7, 2023. In the short term, one thing became clear and undeniable. Gaza's economy collapsed even further, and Israel faced a wave of criticism, with many accusing it of using collective punishment. If you've been watching this channel for a while, especially my episodes about cartels and organized crime, you already know a pattern. Groups like this don't appear in a vacuum. They often grow out of poverty, isolation, and a sense of having no way out. And sooner or later, ordinary people feel like they're left with two options: either suffer under these actors or become part of their system. Gaza is not an exception. And just to be absolutely clear, I'm not saying all Palestinians are Hamas. Not even close. But a significant number do support them. I'll share the polling numbers later in the video. For now, let's continue with what Hamas actually did once it entrenched itself in Gaza. The first and most important move was eliminating political rivals. We're talking about the PLO and Fatah. Hamas launched a broad propaganda campaign portraying these movements as corrupt and useless, claiming they had achieved almost nothing for the Palestinian people. That campaign, combined with violence and intimidation, deepened the split inside the Palestinian national movement. And once Hamas fully locked down power in Gaza, they built something much bigger than a party or even just a military wing. They created their own courts, their own authoritarian institutions. And that became a massive problem. Because Hamas isn't only fighters, it's also police, internal security, informant networks, education systems, and layered control over daily life. They influence nearly every part of Palestinian society in Gaza. And if an ordinary civilian is suspected of collaborating with Israel, the punishment can be immediate: execution. In theory, Hamas claims to govern under Palestinian basic law shaped by Sharia principles. In practice, many observers argue the reality is even harsher. In the early years of their rule, Hamas enforced strict social codes, monitoring how women dressed and pushing forms of gender segregation. Their security apparatus also kept close watch over media and social networks, crushed political opposition, and targeted NGOs. And it's not random. Hamas has a structure that's built for control. At the top sits a leadership body often described as the Political Bureau. And the reason it's so difficult to remove Hamas by taking out one person is simple. This isn't a single leader, it's a layered system. Below that top level are committees handling political, social, cultural, and military functions. There are parallel governing bodies operating in different areas, ministries focused on prisoners, and offices managing ties to Palestinian communities abroad. Then below that, you get regional administrators, security forces, courts, and on and on. It's a complex web, and that's why you can't uproot it by targeting a single figure, even if it's someone at the very top. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, some Hamas leaders have been based in places like Qatar, with others linked to Iran and Turkey. One of the best-known figures tied to Hamas's day-to-day control in Gaza is Yahya Sinwar. He spent 22 years in an Israeli prison for involvement in kidnappings and killings of Israeli soldiers. And in 2011, he was released as part of a prisoner exchange. Over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier held by Hamas. Today, dozens of countries designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. But in some places, that designation applies only to Hamas's military wing. Meanwhile, the UN has not formally designated either the political wing or the military wing as a terrorist organization. And that leads to a big question. If the US and many of the world's largest economies treat Hamas as terrorists, how do they still get money? And how do they keep producing weapons? There's a common misconception that Hamas simply stole UN money meant for Palestinian development. But that's not accurate. Reporting has pointed out that Hamas, as a party, as an armed group, and through its broader network, is cut off from most official international aid tied to the UN, the US, and the European Union. So instead, Hamas funding has historically been replenished through other channels, including private donations and support networks tied to Palestinian communities abroad. Hamas didn't just survive in Gaza, it took over. By 2006, they won a majority in the Palestinian legislative elections and even formed a government. But the real breaking point was 2007. After a period of deadly chaos in Gaza, Hamas didn't just govern. It seized full control, pushing out its rivals and establishing itself as the dominant power in the coastal enclave. From Israel's perspective, the fear was obvious. A leadership this radical could now use Gaza to stockpile resources, build military capacity, and eventually strike Israel, moving toward Hamas's openly stated goal, eliminating the neighboring state. And Hamas wasn't hiding its intentions. Their messaging was blunt. So Israel took the next step, a blockade of Gaza. Israel restricted the movement of people and goods into and out of the Strip. And importantly, it wasn't only Israel. Egypt also tightened its border. At the time, Israel's government argued the blockade was necessary to prevent Hamas from importing materials and developing weapons. Did it work? We can debate that today, especially in the shadow of October 7, 2023. But in the short term, one outcome was clear. Gaza's economy deteriorated further, and Israel faced a wave of criticism, with many accusing it of collective punishment. If you've watched my videos about cartels and criminal networks, you already know the pattern. Organizations like this often grow out of poverty, isolation, and hopelessness, and over time, ordinary people feel trapped, either suffer under these groups or get absorbed into the system around them. Gaza is not an exception. And just to be crystal clear, that does not mean Palestinians are Hamas. Not even close. But a significant number do support Hamas. I'll share polling numbers in a moment. Now here's what Hamas did once it fully entrenched itself in Gaza. The first and biggest move was eliminating political opposition, especially Fatah and the PLO-linked leadership. Hamas ran a massive narrative campaign portraying Fatah and the PLO as corrupt, ineffective, and irrelevant, claiming they had delivered nothing for the Palestinian people. That, combined with force and intimidation, deepened the split inside the Palestinian national movement. And once Hamas consolidated power, it built something far bigger than just a party, or even a militant wing. Hamas became a governing system. Courts, police, security services, informant networks, education, media control, a structure that touches almost every part of daily life in Gaza. And if someone is accused of collaborating with Israel, the punishment can be severe, including execution. In theory, Hamas claims it governs under Palestinian basic law, shaped by Sharia principles. In practice, many observers describe the reality as even more authoritarian. In the early years, Hamas enforced strict social rules, monitoring women's clothing and imposing forms of gender segregation. They also closely monitored journalists and social media, suppressed political opponents, and pressured NGOs. And they can do that because their organization is designed like a layered machine. At the top is a leadership body often described as the political bureau. And this is the key point. You can't erase Hamas by removing one person, because Hamas isn't one leader. It's a network. Below the political bureau sit multiple committees handling political, social, cultural, and military functions. There are parallel governing structures operating in Gaza and in other Palestinian areas, plus institutions focused on prisoners, and offices managing relationships with Palestinian communities abroad. Then below that, regional administrators, security forces, courts, and it keeps going. It's intentionally complex. That's what makes it resilient. Some Hamas leaders operate outside Gaza. Various reports and research organizations have pointed to leadership figures based in places like Qatar, with ties and coordination also linked to Iran and Turkey. One of the best-known Hamas figures connected to day-to-day control in Gaza is Yahya Sinwar. He spent 22 years in an Israeli prison for involvement in kidnappings and killings, and in 2011, he was released as part of a major prisoner exchange, over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for one Israeli soldier held by Hamas. Today, dozens of countries designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, but some apply that label only to Hamas's military wing. Meanwhile, the United Nations has not formally designated Hamas as a terrorist organization in the same way some states have, partly because Hamas is also embedded in local governance and provides social services in Gaza, things like schooling and healthcare infrastructure. And that leads to a major question. If the US and many of the world's largest economies treat Hamas as terrorists, how do they still get money? And how do they keep building weapons? A common misconception is that Hamas simply steals UN money meant for Palestinian development. But reporting suggests it's not that simple. Hamas is largely cut off from official international aid channels tied to the UN system, the US, and the European Union. So instead, funding comes through other routes, including private donors, networks among Palestinians abroad, and support from governments hostile to the US. In the past, funding was also linked to certain Islamic charities. But when these networks are identified, accounts can be frozen and organizations sanctioned. What's much harder to block completely is crypto. And before October 7, 2023, it became widely reported that Hamas solicited donations through cryptocurrency. Now, add another factor, the blockade itself. Because when Gaza is sealed off and over 2 million people are stuck inside, dependent on outside supplies, a controlling group can find ways to profit. For years after the blockade began, Hamas generated revenue by taxing goods that moved through a sophisticated tunnel network, bypassing border crossings. Those tunnels brought in essentials like food and medicine, fuel for electricity generation, and also construction materials, cash, and weapons. In other words, the blockade didn't just isolate Gaza, it also created a black market ecosystem that Hamas could exploit. Then, in 2013, Egypt's new president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, took a far more hostile stance toward Hamas. Egypt's military destroyed many tunnels and launched a major counterterrorism campaign in Sinai. By 2018, Egypt allowed certain commercial goods to enter Gaza again. But Hamas adapted. And by 2021, reports suggested Hamas was earning millions of dollars per month by taxing Egyptian goods imported into Gaza. At this point, you might ask, why would Egypt participate in blocking Gaza? Isn't that their side? It can look that way, but Egypt views Hamas as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Cairo considers a hostile organization. Even Yasser Arafat at times claimed Hamas was not a true representative of the Palestinian people, even suggesting it was manipulated to discredit them. We'll probably never know the full truth behind claims like that, at least not anytime soon. But what we do know is this. Iran is widely described as one of Hamas's most important backers, providing funding, weapons, and training. Some estimates put that support at around $100 million per year for Hamas. And since 2002, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in Turkey, Ankara has repeatedly signaled political support for Hamas, and Turkish agencies have faced international criticism over the nature of that support. Then there's Russia. Ukrainian intelligence has alleged that the Kremlin has transferred weapons to Hamas, including captured small arms, and Russian officials have publicly met with Hamas representatives multiple times, including in September 2022 during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That raised alarms, but largely outside Ukraine, it didn't receive the level of attention you might expect. And zooming out, Hamas isn't acting in isolation. It's part of a broader regional axis that includes Iran, Syria, Lebanon's Hezbollah, and other armed groups. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is often described as the second largest armed faction in Gaza, and it frequently coordinates with Hamas against Israeli forces, including through joint operational frameworks inside Gaza. Exact numbers are hard to verify, but Israeli estimates have suggested Hamas's armed wing could have up to around 40,000 fighters, They've developed vehicles, rocket launchers, rockets with ranges reported up to 255 kilometers, small boats, drones, and even combat divers. And here's the most dangerous part. Hamas adapts. If earlier rhetoric was pure death to Israel without a realistic political pathway, then in 2017, Hamas released a political document that slightly softened its public posture. They still did not recognize Israel as a state, but they signaled acceptance of a temporary Palestinian state within the 1967 lines. Gaza, the West B. They still did not recognize Israel as a state, but they signaled acceptance of a temporary Palestinian state within the 1967 lines. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. That document also claimed their fight was not against Jews as a people, but against what they described as occupation and Zionist aggression. Israel's position was that this was simply rebranding, an attempt to mislead the international community without changing the core ideology. Now, the polling. In June 2023, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research published results suggesting that in a hypothetical presidential election, more than half of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank would vote for a Hamas-backed candidate over the current Palestinian Authority president, Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas has repeatedly postponed elections, and critics argue one reason is fear of losing to Hamas. And if Hamas were to win nationally, that would mean deeper entrenchment, not only in Gaza, but potentially across other territories as well. On the West Bank, Palestinians also point to another factor. While Hamas was growing stronger, Israel continued expanding settlements despite Palestinian opposition and despite the fact that much of the international community considers many of these settlements illegal. Hamas argues that Israeli operations against militants in the West Bank, settlement expansion, thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and the ongoing Gaza blockade were key drivers behind the October 7th attack. Yes, they refer to crackdowns on militants as repression. And that's part of how propaganda works. It reframes reality, fast. And once that machine is running, it's extremely hard to stop. Hamas has also denied targeting civilians on October 7th, claiming they only attacked settlers and military-linked targets. But the reality documented by many investigations and reports is that civilians were killed and kidnapped, and no amount of rhetorical framing can make that disappear. The bigger question is what happens next. Because many analysts have warned that large-scale warfare in Gaza can trigger escalation on other fronts, including the risk of broader confrontation involving Hezbollah and other armed groups. But I won't get ahead of the story. Time will show what comes next. Thank you for watching to the end. If you found this useful, hit like or dislike. Either way, it helps. Drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. See you later.